So in this video, I wanted to go through and take a look at what would happen if you needed to make box and line plots and you were given various data tables. And the reason that I picked this data table is because in the next video that I'm going to do, I'm planning on doing a problem that will require us to use this particular information that we're working on right now to solve another problem. Well, the first thing that we're going to do is make a line plot, because really what the problem asks for us to do is to compare these two different classes and to really take a look and see what would be different about them. So in making the line plot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I'm going to make the top number line that I have here class number 1. So if the first number that we see is 55, I'm just going to come down here and pick my pen tool and say that I'm going to put a dot right here at 55, and then say up here that I've already dealt with it, then come over here to 64 and go, well, that's going to be a dot that's almost to 65, and 83 is going to be almost halfway between 85 and 80. 92 will be closer to 90 than it is to 95. Looking at 100, I'll have a dot that's right here. At 77, I'm going to have a dot that's just about maybe halfway between 75 and 80. At 86, it's going to be a dot that's just after the 85. Looking at 95, there's no current dots there, so I don't need to worry about stacking any. At 80, I get a dot. And then at 98, I get another dot, which is going to be almost to 100. So this entire red plot right here is the line plot for class number 1. Now, if I wanted to turn this into a box plot, all I would have to do is find the median Q1 and Q2. So if I look at this, I'm going to start at this dot right here and this other dot right here, and I'm just going to start putting arrows above each one until I see that I zero in on a particular dot. That first dot that I zero in on is going to be the median of this entire data set. Now, the problem that I have right here is I get to this red dot and this red dot. This red dot was the one that was between 80 and 85, which was this 83 right here, and then this dot right here, which was this number 86. If you notice, I had to put them in order and then go through and try and find which one would divide the two numbers of this data set in half, or the two sides of the data set in half. Well, because there's two numbers that I'm having to use for the median, I'm going to have to take the average of them and say that it's really going to be 83 plus 86 divided by 2. So if I do that, that's going to be 169 over 2, which is going to give me a grand total of 84.5. So knowing where this is, I'm going to say that my median is actually right here at 84.5, and I'm going to put this right here as my median. Well, now looking at that, I now have a left side and a right side, and each one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 data points. In order for me to find Q2 and Q3 and Q1, I'm going to have to find the median on both sides of this median right here. So looking at the right-hand side, I can start going through and saying, okay, I'm going to look at this dot and this dot. Then I move one space over in each direction, and you can see that I'm going to end up landing on this dot as my Q3. So looking at Q3, I get a bar floating above the entire line plot that looks like this. And then doing the same thing over here on the left-hand side, I'm going to start with this this most furthest dot on the left-hand side, and the minimum over here. Then I'm going to go to this dot and this dot. And you can see that I would end up on this dot right here for Q1. So these 3 bars right here are going to be what makes up the box for the box and whiskers plot in class number 1. And then my minimum and my maximum are very easy to pick out from the diagram. So just kind of putting all the bars that I'm going to need up here on the box and whiskers plot, and then actually drawing the box, I can see that this would be the box and whiskers plot for class number 1. Now, coming down a little bit and looking at what would it be for class number 2, I'm going to do the same idea. I'm going to say, okay, I see that I need a dot at 52, which is going to be even further out this way. And then I'm going to see 79, which is going to be right about here. I'm going to see 71, which is right about here. 100, 100 again, 76, which is going to be just a little bit shy of 75, 100 over here again, 78, which is going to be right about here, and then 76, which is right about here. So trying to find the box and whiskers plot numbers that I need here, I'm going to say, okay, well first let's start on this dot right here. This dot right here is going to match up with this dot. This dot is going to match up with this dot. This dot will match up with this dot, and you can see that I will now land on this final dot right here. So this is going to be where my median is, right at around, I believe that was 78. So we see 78 right here, and then I need to find the median on the left-hand and the right-hand side. So taking a look at the right-hand side here, I'm going to say that this dot will match up with this dot. This dot's going to match up with this dot. Well, because these were the last two dots, my median on the right-hand side of the data is actually going to end up exactly at 100, as is the maximum. So this line is actually going to get used twice. Over here on the left-hand side, what's interesting is that I'm going to say that I'm going to match up my minimum with this dot right here. I'm going to match up this dot with this dot right here. So I need to find the halfway spot between these two data points, which were the data point 76 and the data point 78. So looking at this, I'm going to say that this right here, or actually I'm sorry, that is not 78, that is actually the 76. So it's 71 and 76. So looking at 71 plus 76, you get 147. Dividing that by 2, you're going to get a grand total of 73.5. So looking at where 73.5 is going to be, that's going to be roughly right about here. So I'm going to get a vertical bar right here. And ultimately what that means is that I can now say that my box is going to stretch all the way to the minimum, which will be down here at the lowest spot. And then it's going to have a whisker that will stretch all the way up to quartile 1. And then I'm just going to keep going all the way until I get to quartile 3. Now what's interesting about this particular box and whiskers plot here is that if you notice, the max and Q3 are both right here at 100, which means that if we were to start analyzing this data, we would see that there's a way to compare and contrast what we would call the highest 25%, lowest 25% by saying, well, if you look at the lower 25% of grades in each class, 25% of the grades in the first class fell between 55 and this Q1 value. Over here, though, we can see that we drop a little bit further, but it's still comparable. But then the lower 25% of the grades actually only extend to this part right here, which is at that 73.5. And then we see that there's another 25% of the class that scored between 73.5 and what looks to be a 78. And then there's 50% of the class that scored between 78 and 100. Well, that means over half the class scored between 78 and 100. But in class number 1 up here, we get the surprising result that more than half of the class scored right here at an 85, or what was, I believe, actually, I take that back, an 84.5 all the way up to 100. So even though it looks like there's more spread amongst the grades in terms of Class 1 is actually doing a pretty decent job if you look at just the top half of the students. Now another alternative is to look at the middle half of the students and say, well, how does the middle 50% of students do? Well, in Class 1, the middle 50%, they score between this 76 from the looks of it, 77, all the way up to 95, as opposed to Class 2, where the middle 50% has a low right here of that 73.5, and then they score all the way up to 100. So in terms of the middle 50% of students in Class 2, they have a higher score, but there's a way more spread amongst that group than in class 1. So depending on what you're trying to interpret between these two classes, you can go back and forth and say, you might say that one class did better, another class did worse, depending on if you value how much spread there is, in which case you might want there to be very little spread, or you might want to say if the middle of the class is actually scoring the most, then you would actually want to try and go for the group that has the 50% that scores the highest amount, which in that case, class 2 would probably be the best. So when you're answering questions like these, just kind of keep in mind that you don't want to necessarily use just the graph, but you need to interpret what's important given the problem's circumstance. With that, if you have any questions, feel free to comment on this video or send me an email, and I will get back to you as soon as I can.